I'm Mike Costello, and I'm here with Dr. Iris Freelander, and today we'd like to talk to you about living with joy. You know, it seems that so often our lives are filled with activities and responsibilities and burdens that somehow we aren't as joyful as we ought to be. Why is it, do you suppose, Iris, that so many people lack joy in their life?
Well, I think it's just human nature, and very often we watch TV too much and listen and read the news too much, and I mean that literally. And take it to heart, and we integrate it into our being. And when we do, then we're thinking of the negative things of life, because what is the news and what are both the papers and the television, but they're accentuating the negative as a rule.
And so often, if we find ourselves in that negative mindset, then we're certainly not going to be very happy, are we? And there are some people who spend a lot of time in a negative feeling, and a lot of time, as we know, in our counseling work and at the church with people dealing with depression. It seems that there are a lot of depressed people and a lot of unhappy people. Of course, I'm not saying that there are more than there ever have been, but it's been a problem for time, for all time, and that is dealing with depression, dealing with unhappiness, dealing with loneliness, dealing with negativity in our lives. And hopefully in the next 30 minutes, we'll be able to talk about some ways to bring joy back into our lives. But I guess really at the core is how we see life, isn't it? And how we see ourselves, and whether we see life in a negative way, in a hopeless way, in a world surrounded by despair, and whether we see ourselves as limited beings without much potential. And sadly, some people, or many people, do fall into that category, don't they?
Yes, and when they just are depreciate their own worth, self-worth, or the worth of others, then they can fall into that, or when they're too fearful of bad things happening. And again, I think that we can tell if watching the television news is depressing to us, and if it is, just limit it to once or twice a day, preferably once. And for reading the news, if we can, I know you always say that Hattie Garlish, who was the co-foundress of our church, always said, use the newspaper as a prayer journal. So I wouldn't say don't read, but just change our own mindset when we do read. And use it and say and pray. And I know when I read the obituary column, I pray for everyone whose name, if I read the obituary column, for everyone who's there. And it's a nice exercise, and it makes me feel better. And I think it helps, because we create darkness or light with our thinking. And so if we create a greater light, then that's wonderful.
And interesting, the idea that you just shared about reading the obituaries and praying for people, which is a wonderful thing to do. But as we do things for others, as we get out of ourselves, especially when we're depressed or when we're negative or when we're unhappy with life, when we step out of ourselves and go out and do something for other people or with other people, it changes us, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And I hadn't thought of that about reading the obituary and praying for people, because I feel like a voyeur just reading those names of people I've never heard of and never will. So I think that would be the idea back of it. But it does make me feel better to have prayed for them, because I feel as if I've done something worthwhile. It's just like when we say our daily prayers and we pray for others, then we feel good about it. It's as if we're in conspiracy with Creator God. So we feel then that we're doing something positive, and we are.
And at the very heart of it is whether we see good or whether we see bad, whether we see wonderful things in life or whether we see life as a burdensome and difficult process. And for many, it is burdensome, and it is difficult, and it is hopeless. You touched on something a few minutes ago, just a moment ago, that I think we ought to talk about, and that's fear.
Yeah.
And that, you know, in New Thought metaphysical philosophy, we have this simplistic definition of fear that's used tritely, but I think it's very appropriate, and that is taking each of the letters in fear, F-E-A-R, false evidence appearing real. The things that we fear are really, for the most part, things that haven't come to pass yet and probably aren't going to. And many of them, some of them may, but for the most part, the things that we fear are things that are never going to happen and add worry to our lives and concern to our lives and really rob us of joy and rob us of happiness. That fear element is just one of the most paralyzing things, because it paralyzes us emotionally, it paralyzes us from the standpoint of action and life, and it paralyzes us spiritually, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And But when we look at the great ones in history, in the past and in the far ancient past, we see that those people who made the biggest impact on humanity are people who had troubles and problems, and they faced great difficulties in life. And if we look at the life of the Lord Christ when he lived here as Jesus, well, his path was just strewn with problems. And yet he never lost his joyousness of living. And I know a clairvoyant lady who said she's seen Jesus and looks back into the past and sees him. And joyousness was always the greatest attribute he brought forth. And I think that when we look at people who have been meaningful in our lives, each of us and those who hear our program, well, we'll see that the people who are joyous were the ones who always we remember most fondly and who helped lift us. And that's what we need to do with each other, lift, not pull down.
And we need joy in the midst of all circumstances,
Yes.
don't we? It's easy to be joyful in the happy times, but we also need joy in the expectation of good and in also the ability to, within our own minds, visualize ourselves overcoming the difficulties and challenges of life and overcoming the fears of life.
Yes.
Going back to that issue of fear, one of the things that we've talked about before and we talk about it at church and have written a little bit about is that those things that we fear, as Job said, that which I feared has come upon me. And so often our fears become reality, don't they? Because we know that we live in our minds, we know that our thoughts make things, and that as our mind processes the experiences of life, if we have a fearful consciousness, if we're afraid of something, that the creative power of mind will manifest it and will create it in our lives. And then it becomes something that didn't come from God. It didn't come from external forces. It came from our own creation. And I think we need to be aware of that fact, that we are constantly creating our life and creating our environment and creating our world by our thoughts. Thoughts are the single most creative force in the universe. And so as we think these negative thoughts, and as we think about our fears and we give mental strength to them, we create them. And we create them in our bodies, don't we?
Yes, we do very often. And I've seen it happen. I saw it happen recently with a young man who was giving a seminar workshop, and it was new to him. And it seemed that he had done it many times, but he hadn't. And psychosomatically, his back locked up, and he couldn't, 2 or 3 hours prior to his workshop, he couldn't move his head. His back was so locked up. And so he brought that out at the beginning of the seminar, and then everyone just sent him light and love and acceptance. And before he knew it, his body had unlocked. But it's what you were saying about fear. It was the fearfulness of a new endeavor and wanting so much to have it be wonderful. And it's lovely that people care that much. That's a very lovely thing. But we need to just have more faith and confidence that we're going to do that. And so I hope that those who listen to us would know that very often their pain is psychosomatic, and they might deny it because they'll say, well, this pain is real, and it is. And this pain hurts, it does. But this pain is very often caused for a psychosomatic reason. And if they can come to terms with that, then the pain disappears. And some pain might not fall in that category, but I have the inclination that most does.
And so our minds do control our lives, don't they? They control our minds. Our minds control our bodies. They control our spiritual being, and they control the world in which we live. And if we're going to have a joyful consciousness, and of course that's a word that I think is new, not joy. Joy is new for some people, but consciousness is certainly a word that people don't use, and we use it a lot in New Thought and in metaphysical philosophy. Consciousness is the stream of that which comes from our mind, isn't it? And the consciousness that we have, if we have a joyful consciousness, then our lives are going to be joyful. If we have a consciousness of depression and sadness and disparity, then our lives will be like those thoughts.
Exactly. And we can think joyful thoughts, or we can think negative, morose thoughts. And I was just reminded of a memorial service recently for a beautiful woman who has children who are probably in their 30s. And this lady chose to have Joyful, Joyful, We Adored Thee sung as part of her memorial service. And I thought that was quite lovely, because she and I had been talking about what songs we wanted sung at our memorial service long before she was ever ill. And I had remarked that I have my services all written out, an outline for my family to follow, because I think that's the kind thing to do so they don't have to make big decisions. That's difficult for them, and it's easy for us. And so she said, well, I think that's a lovely song, but it's quite unusual for memorial service. And I agreed, yes, it is. But it's happy and it's joyful. And that's our subject today, living with joy. And so I know that having that song sung and her children and family and those who loved her, knowing that she chose it, really lifted their spirits and lifted the event to a higher octave, just because of that it is such a happy song. And so that's one example of how we can make decisions in life as we go through life, to think of positive aspects and then bring them out and bring them forth and live with them. And then it changes the atmosphere in which we live.
It does. It changes the atmosphere, and we've talked in this program at different times about this issue of consciousness and vibration. And I don't want to get too detailed on these issues because they're new to some people. But we certainly believe that thoughts create things and that thoughts produce after their kind. That's what we just touched upon a few moments ago. But our thoughts create vibrations. And the best way to identify that is that all of us have had the feeling when we meet someone where we feel either very positively drawn to them, and I'm not talking about on an intimate level, I'm talking about on a superficial level, and feel very comfortable with them, or we feel not comfortable, or we walk into a room and we feel that this room is so warm and positive, or this room is cold and foreboding. Young people talk about vibes, which is exactly what we're talking about and what people have talked about for generations. That is that thoughts create vibrations, and those vibrations resonate in the area where they're created. And so we actually do send forth vibrations into the environment and to those around us. And we know that joyful people exude joy, and sad people exude sadness, and depressed people exude depression. And so those vibrations are constantly going out. They're going out all around us, and we're absorbing them, and we're being influenced by them. But more importantly, our consciousness, the dynamic of our mind, your mind and my mind and the mind of every single human being. It doesn't have to do with anybody that has special talents, because just part of being human is that we create a vibratory rate by our consciousness, which is the way that our minds operate. And our minds need to operate from a consciousness of joy. And we need to send a joyful consciousness, which comes from joyful thoughts, into the environment and into our lives, so that the vibration that comes is one that is joy-filled. And that's not to say that we're always going to be joy-filled, and we're not talking about the fact that you can stay that way constantly, but in fact we can get good at it and we can get better at it. And you mentioned earlier Christ Jesus, and certainly he is the exemplification of an individual who was able to exude a joyful countenance and consciousness always and everywhere, in the midst of good times and bad times. And some of the time he was sad, and some of the time he was hurt, and some of the time he had difficulty. But in the midst of all of it, he was able to bring himself back to the center of joy and confidence and acceptance and understanding and tolerance and reason in the midst of any circumstance. And joy is what does it, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And if we can remember that divine way shower as being our guide, then we have something to look up to and something to gauge our own appearances and the appearances in our life. And another thing we need to remember is that the joy is residual. When we feel joyful most of the time, then it carries over into the rest of the time when we're not all that joyful. And you can go into a home or a business where people are joyful and positive in their thoughts, and you can feel the energy in that room. It's interesting, isn't it?
It's very interesting, and it's very true. And joy really creates that vibration and sets a whole new mood and tenor for the environment, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And then again, it stays there unless negativity washes it away. And so, and that would be true in our own countenance too, because you see people who look so worn down with grief and strife, and perhaps they've not really have faced the challenges that others do, whose faces show joy and lightness, because it's how we accept and work with what comes our way. So someone said that we're responsible for our faces after we reach a certain age of how we look, and that's true. We do, because if you look at people who are getting on in years but they're happy and joyful, then their countenance looks totally different than those people who are getting on in years and are very depressed and sad. And there is something we can all do about it. We can consciously bring our thoughts up. And how can we do that? By listening to good music, by reading certain inspiring things, by being around people who are positive. And if we know there are people in our existence who are not positive, who pull us down, then it's fair to just keep that acquaintance to a minimum, because we have to really treat our lives as our own lives, as we would treat those of others.
Mhm. It's very important for us to understand that there are things that we can do to bring joy into our lives. And the other thing in the second half of the program, as we move along, that we were going to talk about is the impact of joy upon our physical bodies, because the mind is so connected to the body, and the mind, body, and the spiritual dimension come together as such an important combination that we need to talk about that, and we need to understand and realize that we are changing our bodies and impacting our physical being by the way that we think.
Yes, and it shows up in the way we walk, in the way we talk, and the way we relate to others, the way we look. It shows up in every aspect of our life.
We'd like to pause at this point in the program to offer you the opportunity to receive some literature so that you can continue the ideas and concepts that we're sharing with you.
We would like to give you the opportunity to explore and discover in your own home the new thought teachings that this program is sharing with you by sending you a free copy of one of these booklets. Simply address your request to Confident Living at P.O. Box 7726, Long Beach, California, 90807. Whatever your dream, whatever your vision, you can reach it through Confident Living.
In this second half of the program, we'd like to talk to you about ways in which your joyful attitude, your joyful thoughts, and your joyful feelings can impact upon your physical being and on your mental being, and impact upon the spiritual reality that you have. And one of the things that we always do when we talk about spiritual reality is we want to share with you that we're not talking about having you change your faith or your religious tradition. We're not asking you to believe what we believe from a religious or spiritual standpoint. We're talking about concepts and ideas that can be applied universally to whatever faith tradition you find yourself in. When we have joyful thoughts, you touched upon it before the break, we certainly can see it in the countenance of the people who are joyful, but we also know that a lack of joy and the opposite of that, which is sadness and depression and the negative feelings of life, can bring upon physical debilitation, illness, and disease. Medicine knows that today, don't they?
Yes, they do, and they point it out very often, and it impacts on our immune system, because I think everyone knows about the endorphin level of the human body, and the endorphin level is higher when we're happy and joyous, and lower when we're not. And the more endorphins that the brain, it's called sometimes the pleasure connection, and the higher the endorphin level, then the more healthy the body, because the immune system is impacted. And when we look at it that way, it would behoove us all to live to the highest of our ability and not get caught up in negativity, because we know that we are creating that which we think is creating the body that we live in.
And also stress and negativity create high blood pressure for us. It contributes to our obsessions of eating and drinking and doing other unhealthy things, the use of drugs and the like, both legal and illegal. And so all of these things contribute to our physical well-being. And we really can have a real improvement in our physical health by a change in our mental attitude, can't we?
Yes, it is. And we need to watch to see what makes us feel depressed and what pulls us down, and then change our life patterns. There's no reason we can't change. And if we can change our attitude, we might not be able to change lots of things in our lives because they're controlled by others in to a great measure, but we can change how we relate to those things. And so I would say we have to consciously sometimes do that change. And when we do and we see the result, then it's so wondrous that it inspires us to continue in that way.
It also gives us energy,
Yes.
doesn't it?
Yeah.
It gives us energy, and it gives us a joy for living. It gives us zest. It gives us hope. It gives us a lot of things when we have a joyful attitude in our lives and a joyful consciousness in our minds.
Yes, and we impact upon others, certainly. And so it should give us joy to know that we're impacting on others in a positive way as opposed to a negative way. And I think most people really want that to be manifest in their lives. Most people don't want to pull others down, but sometimes they can't. They can't help themselves. But we really can help ourselves by a conscious measure of what we read, what we think, and and listening to good music again, and the life patterns we form. We can change those life patterns, and I might say that one way we can change is just through an exercise program. Very often, just a good exercise program will help us to get out of the doldrums faster than anything else.
And that can be as simple as even walking, can't it?
Exactly.
And you and I are
Yes.
great walkers, and
Yes.
that's a good exercise. Before time gets away from us, I want to spend some time talking about the spiritual aspects of dealing with joy, or of manifesting and creating joy. And a great way is meditation. And you
Yes.
know, very few programs get away from us so that we don't talk about meditation. But in today's environment, there's such a wonderful resurgence or a wonderful introduction of meditation into the spiritual life of people of all faiths. And that comes from an introduction of both Eastern philosophy into the West, and the understanding of what meditation is and the value of it. And certainly people of all faith traditions can use meditation. Some faith traditions, and certainly those in the West, don't use it as much, or have a different view of meditation, because so often we see in Western theology and in traditional Christian theology the teaching that meditation is really directed and is much more like prayer or exercise. But in fact, the meditation that we talk about is Eastern and Western meditation coming together, and that is really listening and centering, isn't it? And
Yes,
that centering can get us into a joyful state.
Yes, it can and will automatically do so, because we're attuning our consciousness to Creator God. And when we do that, we can't be but joyous. So it would behoove us to do that first thing in the morning. And then throughout the day, we can have little meditations, many meditations, so that we're just attuning ourselves, and we're not really going anywhere or doing anything but just the attunement, because that might be all the time we have privately to do that. But if we consciously do that, it makes a big difference in our lives, and we go through the day feeling relaxed at the end of the day instead of tense and nervous.
Right. And we begin the meditation process with deep breathing, don't we?
Yes.
And we talked about exercise and how important that is to bring us into a joyful spirit and a joyful consciousness. But meditation and simply deep breathing can bring us into joy. And it's a little bit like we were all taught when we were children, when we get upset, to count 10, or before we say something that we ought not to say, to take a deep breath. Well, that's good advice, and it's really advice that moves us into the preparation for really a time of meditation. And we begin by taking a few deep breaths and cleansing breaths, and then going into this silent centering presence.
Yes, and when we do that, we're tuning ourselves to a higher power, and as we do that, it can't help but lift us, and we then reflect on the lives of others. And I was just thinking, when we have pets, they bring us great joy, and as we meditate and as we keep our consciousness high, then it helps them just as it helps the people around us. It helps anyone or anything around us. And I personally think it helps our equipment work better. If we pray for our refrigerators and our stoves and our automobiles and whatever we use throughout the day, I think it sends light and energy into that equipment. So to me, it helps to just send out positive energy to everything around us. And through meditation, we're able to do that more fully.
And in meditation, we are often, although we certainly can ask questions and have a dialogue, but For the most part, in meditation, we're listening, aren't we?
Yeah.
Which is really difficult for our Western minds, and certainly difficult for traditional religious people, to simply be silent. In New Thought and metaphysical Christianity, we talk so often about, and in the 30s and 40s, the term was used was entering the silence.
Mm-hmm.
But being silent and centered, regardless of circumstance and situation, and then in that silence and centering, to accept and receive the joyous feelings that are natural and normal to us, is really a wonderful process.
Yes, and when we do that, we're more fair to ourselves and we're helping all of humanity. And if we can remember that our mood and our attitude toward life impacts on the mass consciousness, the global brain, and therefore on everything and everyone, then I think we might be more altruistically inclined to keep our consciousness high and to be joyous and to be deliberately joyous. And someone said people are just as happy as they make up their minds to be. And that's certainly true. Sometimes it's a conscious effort to stay in a high mode of joyousness. But it pays off in the long run so much more beautifully. And life is so much easier when we go through life in a joyous way than if we drag.
And it's always our choice, isn't
Yes,
it? You know, and as we come into the last minutes, life is filled with choices. And we always have a choice. And the choice is whether to be happy or whether to be sad, whether to be joy-filled or whether to be unhappy, and whether to have prosperity and abundance or limit and lack, whether or not we're going to have health or whether we're going to have illness or disease, and how we're going to feel in the midst of those circumstances.
Yes, and we all answer yes, but I have all this in my life which is so unpleasant and so bad. Yes, but we can say yes, but we can turn that around and look for the good in it and change our own attitude. And as we change our own attitude and look for the good, then we see the good and we see how this change is necessary, and then we can be joyous. Because we have to, again, it's a conscious effort. And we have to live with a positive attitude instead of the negative, and that's what joyousness is. It's just accepting that whatever is in our lives is for a positive purpose.
All right. And we need to understand that the circumstances and situations of our life are going to bring challenge, are going to bring change, are going to bring difficulty. But each one of them can be met with a joyful consciousness and a joyful countenance and a joyful life. And we hope that the information we've shared with you has been useful, and we look forward to seeing you next time.